The sweet scent of vanilla and chocolate wafted through the air as kids played on the sidewalk outside Joe's ice cream shop in downtown Oakland. It was one of those perfect California Sundays, not too hot, not too cold, just right for spending time outdoors. The shop's colorful awning cast playful shadows on the pavement below, where children of all ages enjoyed their frozen treats. Among them was a bright-eyed 9-year-old girl carefully riding her shiny new purple bicycle. Her pink helmet matched perfectly with her backpack, and she wore a determined expression as she practiced the safety rules her parents had drilled into her head. Stay close to the curb, signal before turning, and always be aware of your surroundings. The bicycle had been her birthday present just 2 weeks ago. It wasn't just any bike, it was the one she'd been dreaming about for months, with special grip handles and a basket decorated with butterflies. Every time she rode it, she felt like she was flying, free as a bird in the clear blue sky. The ice cream shop owner watched from behind his counter through the large front window, smiling at the scene outside. He'd known the little girl since she was barely tall enough to see over his counter. Back then, she would stand on her tiptoes, pointing excitedly at the different flavors, while her father lifted her up to get a better view. Now she was tall enough to see all 31 flavors without any help, though she always chose the same thing, mint chocolate chip with extra sprinkles. Today was special because it was the first time her parents had allowed her to ride to the ice cream shop by herself. Well, not completely by herself. They lived just 3 blocks away, and several neighbors had promised to keep an eye out for her. Still, she felt grown up and responsible, carefully counting her allowance money before leaving home and wearing her new watch to make sure she wouldn't be late getting back. Other kids played nearby, some on skateboards, others drawing with chalk on the sidewalk, and a few playing an elaborate game of hopscotch. The sound of laughter mixed with the distant church bells ringing 3 o'clock, creating the perfect soundtrack for a Sunday afternoon in the city. The little girl made another careful loop around the block, waving to Mrs. Thompson, who was watering her prize-winning roses. She'd already finished her ice cream cone, but wasn't quite ready to head home. The weather was too perfect, the day too beautiful to end just yet. She practiced her hand signals again, left arm out for a left turn, right arm out for a right turn, just like her dad had taught her. From the coffee shop next door, several customers watched the children play, some reminiscing about their own childhood days of carefree bike rides and endless summer afternoons. An elderly couple sat on a nearby bench, sharing a newspaper and occasionally looking up to smile at the young riders passing by. The girl's father, the city's mayor, had been clear about the boundaries: stay within sight of Joe's ice cream shop, don't talk to strangers, and be home before 4. She took these rules seriously, just like she took seriously her role as the mayor's daughter. Her teachers often said she had her father's sense of responsibility and her mother's kind heart. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as she made one final loop around the block. Her new bike sparkled in the sunlight, the purple paint catching the light just right. She'd earned this bike through good grades and helping around the house, and nothing made her prouder than seeing it shine as she rode down the street. Little did she know that this peaceful Sunday afternoon was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would change not just her life, but the entire community's perspective on law enforcement and racial justice. For now, though, she was just a happy 9-year-old girl enjoying the simple pleasure of riding her new bike on a beautiful day, her heart as light as the clouds floating overhead in the crystal-clear Oakland sky. Officer Richard Wilson sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as he watched the street corner. 15 years on the force had left him with deeply ingrained habits and assumptions that often clouded his judgment. The afternoon sun reflected off his badge as he scanned the area, looking for anything that seemed out of place in this upper-middle-class neighborhood. His radio crackled with routine updates, but his attention was fixed on something else entirely. Through his windshield, he watched the young black girl riding what he recognized as an expensive bicycle, one that cost more than most people in this neighborhood could afford, or so he thought. The sight didn't sit right with him, stirring up prejudices he'd never bothered to examine. The patrol car's air conditioning hummed softly as he made mental calculations, all of them based on unfair assumptions rather than facts. He hadn't received any reports of stolen bikes in the area. There were no complaints from neighbors. Nothing but his own biased suspicions prompted him to act. Yet he reached for his car door handle, his decision already made. The other children playing nearby paid little attention as the police car pulled up to the curb. They were used to seeing patrol cars in the neighborhood, usually just passing through, keeping the peace. But this time was different. Officer Wilson stepped out with purpose, his boots hitting the pavement with heavy steps that seemed to echo in the peaceful afternoon air. He adjusted his belt, making sure his badge caught the sunlight, a small power play he'd developed over years of similar confrontations. His approach was deliberately intimidating, something he'd done countless times before when dealing with what he called suspicious individuals. The fact that this was a child didn't seem to register in his mind. The girl noticed him approaching and slowed her bike, doing exactly what her parents had taught her, being respectful to law enforcement. She even gave him a small wave, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Her innocent gesture was met with a stern face and aggressive posture that seemed entirely out of place given the situation. "Hey you, stop right there," Officer Wilson called out, his voice carrying across the street and drawing attention from nearby pedestrians. His hand rested on his belt, near his radio, in what he considered a standard approach position. The girl's smile faded as she realized something wasn't right about this interaction. The ice cream shop owner watched through his window, his hand already reaching for his phone. He knew this girl, knew her family, and something about the officer's approach set off alarm bells in his mind. Other adults in the area began to take notice too, their casual afternoon conversations dying down as they observed the scene unfolding before them. "Where did you get that bike?" Officer Wilson demanded, not bothering with any preliminary greetings or attempting to put the child at ease. His voice carried that edge of authority he'd perfected over years of service, the tone that expected immediate compliance rather than explanation. The young girl's voice trembled slightly as she answered, explaining that it was her birthday present. She even pointed to the custom nameplate on the bike's frame, but Officer Wilson wasn't interested in explanations. In his mind, he'd already written the story, one based on prejudice rather than facts. Several bystanders had stopped to watch now, their faces showing growing concern. A couple walking their dog paused on the corner, the woman already pulling out her phone to record what was happening. The atmosphere had shifted from peaceful Sunday afternoon to tense confrontation in a matter of moments. Officer Wilson moved closer, his shadow falling across the girl's bike. He didn't notice the high-quality security cameras outside the ice cream shop recording every moment. He didn't see the concerned faces of the regulars who knew exactly who this little girl was. And most importantly, he didn't realize he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career, one that would expose his prejudices and shake the entire police department to its core. The young girl's voice shook as she tried again to explain about her birthday present, her small hands gripping the purple handlebars of her beloved bike. "Sir, my dad gave it to me. I can call him right now," she said, her words carrying across the now quiet street. But Officer Wilson wasn't listening. He'd already made up his mind, and nothing she said seemed to matter. "Step away from the bicycle," he commanded, his voice growing harder. The girl's eyes widened with confusion and fear. She'd never been spoken to like this before, especially not by a police officer. Her parents had always taught her that police were there to help, but this didn't feel like help at all. The growing crowd of onlookers watched in disbelief as the officer reached for his handcuffs. The metallic clicks seemed to echo off the buildings, drawing gasps from those gathered around. A teenager on his skateboard nearly dropped his phone as he rushed to start recording. The afternoon sun caught the lens of at least a dozen other cameras being raised by concerned citizens. "Please," the girl whispered, tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. "I just want to call my dad." Her pink helmet, the one that matched her backpack perfectly, suddenly felt too tight. Her hands trembled as Officer Wilson moved closer, his shadow falling over her like a dark cloud on what had been a perfect day. The ice cream shop owner had already dialed the mayor's office, his voice urgent as he explained the situation to the secretary. "You need to get in here now," he insisted, watching through his window as the scene unfolded. His free hand gripped the counter so tight his knuckles turned white. A woman pushing a stroller stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. "She's just a child. What are you doing?" Others joined in, their voices rising in protest. But Officer Wilson seemed to exist in his own bubble, immune to the outrage building around him. The cold metal of the handcuffs touched the girl's wrists, and she let out a soft sob that seemed to pierce the hearts of everyone watching. Her bike, the beautiful purple bike she'd been so proud of just moments ago, clattered to the sidewalk. The butterfly decorations on the basket caught the sunlight one last time before the bike fell, a tragic symbol of innocence interrupted. "I know my rights," the young girl said through her tears, showing a maturity beyond her years. "My dad taught me. I'm supposed to be able to call him." But Officer Wilson merely grunted, seemingly annoyed by her knowledge of basic civil rights. He didn't notice how his actions were being documented by dozens of phones, how his every move was being scrutinized by an increasingly angry crowd. The afternoon breeze carried whispers of disbelief and outrage. A retired teacher shook her head in dismay, remembering this same little girl from community events where she'd spoken with such pride about her father's work for the city. An off-duty nurse stepped closer, wanting to make sure the child wasn't being hurt. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Wilson began reciting the Miranda rights to a 9-year-old girl, his voice mechanical and cold. The words felt absurd in the context, rights meant for adults being read to a child who should have been enjoying her Sunday afternoon ice cream. The girl stood there, tears streaming down her face, but holding herself with remarkable dignity. She'd seen her father handle difficult situations with grace, and even in her fear, she tried to do the same. Her small shoulders stayed straight despite the weight of the handcuffs, her chin lifted slightly even as tears continued to fall. The crowd had grown larger now, their murmurs of protest becoming more vocal. Phone cameras captured every moment, every tear, every unnecessary action by the officer who seemed determined to criminalize a child's innocent bike ride. Social media was already lighting up with the first posts about the incident, spreading the story faster than anyone could have imagined. What Officer Wilson didn't know, what he would soon learn to his great dismay, was that help was already on the way. The mayor's office had been alerted, and several police officials were rushing to the scene. The next few minutes would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire police department and the community it served. Inside Joe's ice cream shop, the owner's hands trembled as he dialed the mayor's office for the third time in 5 minutes. The afternoon sun streamed through the shop's large windows, casting long shadows across the checkered floor as he paced back and forth. "Listen to me," he said urgently into the phone. "I've known this little girl since she was barely able to walk. Her father, the mayor, needs to know what's happening right now." Outside, the crowd had grown from a handful of concerned onlookers to dozens of citizens, their voices rising in unified protest. A young college student's live stream had already caught the attention of local news stations. Her hands were steady as she captured every moment, her voice providing clear commentary about what was unfolding before her eyes. "This is happening right now, outside Joe's ice cream shop on Oak Street," she narrated, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "A police officer has handcuffed a young girl. Yes, you heard that right, a child, for riding her own bicycle." The comments on her stream exploded with outrage, shares multiplying by the second. Mrs. Thompson, still wearing her gardening gloves, stepped forward from the crowd. She'd watched this little girl grow up, had waved to her countless times as she passed by with her father during their evening walks. "Officer," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom, "what you're doing isn't just wrong, it's shameful." The afternoon breeze carried the sound of more sirens in the distance. Someone in the crowd mentioned that local news vans were on their way. The hashtag Justice for Our Children was already trending across social media platforms, with the video clips spreading like wildfire through the community's digital networks. A group of teenagers from the nearby high school had formed a semicircle near the scene, their phones raised high to document everything. They'd been taught about civil rights in school just last week, and now they were witnessing a clear violation of those rights in broad daylight. One of them, a student journalist, was already drafting a story for the school newspaper. The retired judge who lived around the corner arrived, drawn by the commotion. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his presence adding weight to the growing protest. His eyes narrowed as he watched Officer Wilson's conduct, mentally noting every procedural violation, every overstepped boundary. "My dad's the mayor." The little girl called out again, her voice stronger now despite her tears. The words rippled through the crowd, spreading from person to person like waves in a pond. Those who hadn't known before quickly understood the magnitude of the officer's mistake. Phones buzzed with text messages and calls, spreading the news further into the community. The ice cream shop owner had finally gotten through to the right person. He watched through his window as his call set off a chain reaction at City Hall. "Yes, right outside my shop," he confirmed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "And Officer Wilson isn't listening to anyone. He needs to be stopped before this gets even worse." A local church group that had been meeting nearby arrived on the scene, their presence adding to the growing crowd. The pastor's wife, a former civil rights activist, immediately began documenting everything she saw. Her years of experience told her this moment would become a catalyst for change in their community. The air grew thick with tension as more people arrived. Parents pulled their children close, explaining in hushed voices what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a news story, it was a teaching moment, though not the kind anyone would have wished for. The crowd's energy shifted from shock to determined resistance, their presence a silent but powerful protest against injustice. Social media notifications pinged continuously as the story spread beyond their neighborhood, beyond their city. Local news stations began picking up the live streams, and reporters were rushing to the scene. The community's response was becoming a story in itself, a testament to how people could come together in the face of injustice. What had started as a peaceful Sunday afternoon had transformed into a moment that would be remembered for years to come. The mayor's car was already en route, but the community wasn't waiting for official intervention. They had become witnesses, documentarians, and protesters, ordinary citizens standing up against an extraordinary injustice unfolding before their eyes. The sound of screeching tires cut through the afternoon air as 3 black SUVs rounded the corner onto Oak Street. The crowd parted like waves, all eyes turning to watch as the mayor's motorcade came to a stop. The lead vehicle's door flew open before it had fully stopped, and out stepped the mayor, his Sunday suit jacket fluttering in the breeze. The police chief emerged from the second vehicle, his face set in a grim expression. Behind them, several city officials and the mayor's security detail quickly formed a protective circle. But the mayor was already moving forward, his eyes fixed on his handcuffed daughter. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by the fierce determination of a father whose child was in distress. Officer Wilson's face drained of color as realization dawned. The badge on his chest suddenly felt heavy as he watched the mayor approach. The crowd had fallen silent, phones still recording, capturing every second of what was about to unfold. The only sound was the gentle sobbing of the young girl and the steady footsteps of her father approaching. "Daddy," the girl cried out, her voice breaking through the tension. The mayor's pace quickened, but his steps remained measured, controlled. Years of public service had taught him the power of maintaining composure, even in the most challenging moments. But anyone watching could see the storm brewing in his eyes. The police chief stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "Officer Wilson, stand down immediately." The words carried the weight of command, but Wilson seemed frozen in place, his hands still gripping the handcuff keys. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. He had handcuffed the mayor's daughter, a 9-year-old girl, without cause. The mayor reached his daughter first, kneeling down to her level despite his perfectly pressed suit. His hands were gentle as they brushed away her tears, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the hushed atmosphere. "I'm here now, baby girl. Everything's going to be okay." The tenderness of the moment brought tears to the eyes of many watching. The police chief had already radioed for internal affairs, his words clipped and precise as he reported the incident. Officer Wilson's badge number was noted, his actions documented. The chief's face showed a mix of anger and disappointment. This was exactly the kind of incident he'd been working to prevent in the department. With trembling hands, Officer Wilson finally moved to remove the handcuffs, but the mayor held up his hand, stopping him. "No," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "I'll do it." He took the keys from Wilson's unresisting hands, his movements deliberate as he freed his daughter from the restraints. The metallic click of the handcuffs opening seemed to echo in the silence. The young girl immediately wrapped her arms around her father's neck, burying her face in his shoulder. His hand gently cradled the back of her head, still covered by the pink helmet she'd worn for her bike ride. The mayor's other hand still held the handcuffs, and he passed them to the police chief without a word. Someone in the crowd started clapping, and soon others joined in. It wasn't celebration. It was solidarity, support, a community's way of saying they stood with this father and his daughter. The mayor lifted his child into his arms, her bike momentarily forgotten on the sidewalk. A member of his security team quickly moved to retrieve it, handling it with the care one might give to evidence. The police chief stepped closer to Officer Wilson, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Turn in your weapon and badge. You're suspended, effective immediately." Wilson's shoulders slumped as the weight of his actions finally hit him fully. His career, built over 15 years, had crumbled in less than 15 minutes. The mayor turned to face the crowd, his daughter still in his arms. The setting sun cast long shadows behind them as he surveyed the faces of his constituents, his neighbors, his community. In that moment, he wasn't just a mayor looking at voters. He was a father looking at the people who had stood up to protect his child. His voice, when he spoke, carried both authority and gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, his words reaching every corner of the gathered crowd. "Thank you for being here, for watching out for our children, for standing up against injustice." The moment would be replayed on news channels across the country, but for those present, it was deeply personal. A reminder that change often begins with a single moment of standing up for what's right. The next morning, the sun rose over a city forever changed. News vans lined the streets outside City Hall, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Inside his office, the mayor sat behind his desk, his daughter's pink helmet placed carefully beside him, a reminder of why this fight mattered. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since the incident. National news networks, civil rights organizations, and concerned citizens from across the country all wanted to hear the story. But before addressing any of them, the mayor had spent the morning with his daughter, making sure she felt safe, loved, and understood that none of this was her fault. Outside the mayor's office, protesters gathered peacefully, holding signs that read, "Protect our children" and "Reform now." The crowd was diverse. Parents, teachers, students, and community leaders, all united in their demand for change. Local food trucks had shown up to provide free meals to the protesters, turning the gathering into a demonstration of community solidarity. Inside the police department, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Wilson's locker was being cleared out as Internal Affairs conducted their investigation. Other officers watched silently, some reflecting on their own biases, others worried about the department's future. The police chief had called an emergency meeting, making it clear that this incident would lead to major changes. The ice cream shop owner had turned his store into an unofficial community center. People gathered there, sharing stories of similar experiences that had gone unreported. He gave out free ice cream to children, trying to restore some normalcy to their corner of the city. The young girl's abandoned bike still stood in his shop window, now surrounded by flowers and notes of support. Local news stations played the video footage on repeat, each viewing revealing new details: the officer's aggressive approach, the community's immediate response, the mayor's controlled fury. Social media exploded with discussions about racial profiling and police reform. The hashtag that started locally had gone national, drawing attention from civil rights leaders across the country. The mayor's secretary worked tirelessly, organizing press conferences and meetings with community leaders. But her most important task was scheduling trauma counseling sessions for the young girl. The mayor had been clear: his daughter's well-being came before any political response. In the city council chamber, emergency meetings were held to discuss immediate policy changes. The incident had exposed gaps in police training and oversight that could no longer be ignored. Council members who had previously resisted reform now sat quietly, watching video clips of a handcuffed 9-year-old crying for her father. The police chief appeared on local television, his usual confidence replaced by genuine remorse. "What happened yesterday isn't just a failure of one officer," he admitted. "It's a failure of our entire system, and we're going to fix it." His words were met with cautious hope from a community tired of empty promises. The young girl stayed home from school that day, surrounded by family and friends. Her teacher had sent over a care package filled with her favorite books and a heartfelt note from her classmates. The kitchen table was covered with cards and letters from strangers across the city, each one expressing support and encouragement. By afternoon, the mayor had prepared his official statement. His team had drafted several versions, but he'd torn them all up, choosing instead to speak from his heart. As he adjusted his tie and looked at his reflection, he knew this wasn't just about being a mayor. It was about being a father, about protecting not just his child, but all children. The press conference room buzzed with anticipation. Cameras clicked and whirred as the mayor approached the podium, his security detail scanning the crowd. But today, he wasn't just addressing the media. He was speaking to every parent who'd ever worried about their child's safety, every person who'd ever felt targeted because of their race, every citizen who believed that change was possible. 6 months after that fateful Sunday afternoon, the city had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The police department building now housed a new civil rights and community relations division, its glass doors always open to the public. Inside, officers underwent intensive bias training, led by experts who understood that real change starts with acknowledging uncomfortable truths. The young girl, now 10 years old, stood at a podium in her school auditorium, her voice clear and confident as she shared her story with fellow students. The pink helmet she'd worn that day sat on display beside her, no longer just a safety device but a symbol of change. Her father watched from the back of the room, pride mixing with lingering pain in his eyes. The Community Oversight Committee, born from that incident, met every Thursday in the renovated conference room at City Hall. Its members included teachers, social workers, former officers, and everyday citizens who believed in the possibility of positive change. They reviewed police practices, investigated complaints, and ensured that every voice in the community was heard. Outside Joe's ice cream shop, a small bronze plaque had been installed. It didn't mention names or point fingers. Instead, it simply read, "On this spot, a community stood together and chose justice over silence." The shop owner had turned one wall into a community bulletin board where people posted stories of positive interactions between police and citizens, creating a visual reminder that change was possible. The Police Academy's training program had been completely revamped. New recruits now spent time working with community organizations before ever putting on a badge. They learned about the city's history, its diverse neighborhoods, and most importantly, about the people they were sworn to protect and serve. The incident was used as a case study, not to shame, but to teach. The young girl's bicycle had found a new home in the City Museum's Civil Rights exhibition. Next to it, a timeline showed the changes implemented in the months following the incident. Mandatory body cameras, community policing initiatives, youth outreach programs, and strict new guidelines for interactions with minors. Each change represented a step toward a more just future. Former Officer Wilson had left law enforcement, but his story became part of the department's training material, an example of how unchecked biases could destroy careers and damage communities. He'd written a public letter of apology, acknowledging his mistakes and encouraging other officers to examine their own prejudices. The mayor's daughter started a youth advocacy group called Kids for Change, which met after school to discuss civil rights and community relations. What began with 5 students now had chapters in schools across the city. They organized bike rides that brought together children, parents, and police officers in a celebration of community and understanding. Local businesses had joined the effort for change. The bike shop offered free safety classes, bringing together children from different neighborhoods. The community center hosted monthly forums where residents and police officers could talk openly about their concerns and hopes for the future. These conversations weren't always easy, but they were always necessary. The city's annual budget now included substantial funding for community policing programs and youth outreach initiatives. Officers were assigned to regular neighborhood walks, not to patrol, but to build relationships. They knew the names of the children who played in the parks, the elderly residents who needed checking on, the small business owners who kept the community thriving. In her bedroom, the young girl kept a journal of all the changes she'd witnessed. Sometimes she wrote about the hard days, the nightmares that still came occasionally, the moments when fear crept back in. But mostly, she wrote about hope. About watching officers help kids with their homework at the community center. About the new friends she'd made through her advocacy work. About the way her city had come together to say that every child deserved to feel safe. 1 year to the day after the incident, the mayor stood again at City Hall. This time, he wasn't addressing a crisis, he was celebrating progress. Behind him stood a diverse group of community leaders, police officers, and citizens. His daughter sat in the front row, wearing a t-shirt that read, "Change starts with us." As he spoke about the transformation their city had undergone, he knew that while they hadn't solved every problem, they'd shown what was possible when a community refused to let injustice stand.